Chapter 17, Lesson 4, The Rough Rider President. Yeah, we're going to be talking about Teddy Roosevelt today, and here we go. So, under Teddy Roosevelt, the U.S. started to become more and more assertive in the world and really a more respected world power. He actually, at one point, he sent the newly constructed Great White Fleet of the U.S. Navy all around the world to sort of show it off and show we are a new world power to be reckoned with. And that was just sort of his style. He certainly did have a lot of that. So he was kind of an accidental president on some level, because one of the main reasons why he became president was because people didn't like the way he was governing in New York as governor of New York. And so therefore they went ahead and said, hey, what can we do with this guy? Let's nominate him for vice president. That he can't do any harm there. And then what ended up happening was William McKinley was assassinated at a World's Fair, and basically this guy, he came up to him, he was an anarchist, someone who was against government, and he was acting like a veteran that had a bandaged hand, and in the bandaged hand there was actually a gun, and then he shot William McKinley at point blank range. It looked like he was going to recover, and then he did not. And so suddenly, you know, probably the worst nightmare of a lot of these guys, that Teddy Roosevelt becoming president, because it wasn't going to be business as usual. Large companies, things like Standard Oil, U.S. Steel, stuff like that, were making a tremendous amount of money. A lot of railroad companies were making a lot of money. And there were a lot of really, really poor people as well. And many people didn't like the way that this was playing out, so they did want substantial reforms. And during Teddy Roosevelt's time period, it's generally called the progressive period, or progressive era, because some of these things start getting addressed, and the government starts to pass laws that they give the government more control of things that business has not done a particularly good job of controlling previously. And Teddy Roosevelt, he called it the square deal, that everyone deserves a square deal. Now, during this time period, there were these journalists that were called muckrakers, because the idea was that they would sort of take a rake and go at the bottom of a creek or a lake and pull up the stuff at the bottom, the muck that's at the bottom that people try to not pay attention to. And that was the term that was used for them, and a sort of a mean term, but then they took it. And what they were people who pointed out some of the really bad practices of businesses. And one of the first ones was a guy named Upton Sinclair, who wrote about the Chicago meatpacking industry, about how really unhealthy and dirty it was. Thankfully, things have changed since then, but it was nasty, where what would happen would be someone would go ahead and they'd have things like the meat that had been eaten parts of by rats, and they would just throw the rats and the meat into the sausage packaging machinery, and so then people would eat that, and it was just nasty all around. So one of the things that happened was this book, it detailed a lot of these problems, and when it came out, it was really effective because people started to realize what a problem was. And Teddy Roosevelt, he pushed for something called the Pure Food and Drug Act, also the Meat Inspection Act. And that made sure that food and medicine were safer. And again, those are still in effect today, where so don't worry about the stuff that you eat today as much. Now, Ida Turnbull, she was a woman who wrote about the unfair practice of Standard Oil, and she thought, yeah, this was just wrong, that a company could generate so much money and so much control on an important industry. And this was all set up by something called trusts, which were these an organization formed by a group of companies in an industry, and they would decide how much to charge for their products as kind of a group. And so therefore it was different than monopoly, but in some ways it acted the same way, because they determined price controls and things like that. And Teddy Roosevelt is really the first president to sort of stand up against these big trusts. And he didn't break up all the trusts, but he said ones that were particularly bad deserved to be broken up, and broke up about 25 trusts during his time period into smaller companies. And still today, that's a big point that sometimes people talk about in terms of when a business gets too big, should it be broken up so you have more competition in the industry? Another big thing he was really a lot of ways responsible for was the Panama Canal. And there's a clear need for a canal because if you look from New York City to San Francisco by boat, it's 5,200 miles. Or if you have to go around South America, it's 13,000 miles. So it's a huge, huge difference. And the logical place to build the canal is going to be right here, where the narrowest part is. At one point, there were people who wanted it to be built up in Nicaragua because there's a big lake there. You could kind of go across, but that didn't happen. The French had tried previously to build a canal, and they had failed. And the U.S., they want to purchase the land from Colombia, who owned it at the time period, and Colombia says no, so the U.S. basically funds a revolution there and makes it independent, and then purchases that land from the new Panamanian government who sort of owe them. And this is where the Panama Canal Zone is here. And it was a really dangerous project in a lot of ways. For one thing, the biggest issue, yeah, there was the construction, and that was very, very difficult in a lot of ways. But the bigger challenge was actually diseases, two diseases in particular, malaria and then also yellow fever that were transmitted by mosquitoes that had the disease. And eventually, I mean, these killed thousands of people. I mean, they still kill thousands of people in the world today, but as you're trying to build a canal in the United States, people aren't used to these diseases. And what ended up happening was eventually the guy who was in charge of sort of figuring out how to stop this disease from happening was spread oil on top of the water, because water is where the mosquitoes would breed in standing water, like puddles and things like that. If you put oil on top, then they couldn't breed in those, and eventually enough of them die off that it isn't as big a problem. So about 40,000 people worked on this canal, and even though over 5,000 people lost their lives, eventually it is built, and it takes a long, long time. 1903 was when the United States purchased it, and 1914 is when it's finally made. This is actually an image of part of the construction, and it was huge. Now, there's a lot of new inventions that come up during the early part of the 20th century, late part of the 19th century, that have a huge impact on us today. Probably one of the most famous ones and most recognizable one is that plane, that first airplane. And now, Orville and Wilbur Wright, they had built bicycles. They'd owned a bicycle shop before, and they'd experiment with gliders. And eventually, they got to the point where they figured out a way to add a motor on effectively. And the plane was fairly light, but wasn't maneuverable. But it did actually fly, and it flew for a reasonable amount for the time period. So it's considered to be the first flight. Because it glided, it went about 100 feet before landing, and by motor power, and this is the first mechanized flight. So that's the precursor to all other airplanes. And the Model T was also a huge deal. Automobiles, there had been some in Europe, but they were expensive and handmade. Henry Ford finds a cheaper, easier way to do it by using an assembly line. What would happen to be is that these things were on these Model Ts that would go on a belt, and then the belt would just transport the things throughout the factory on a kind of a long, winding sort of escalator, like those things you see in the airport, those long flat escalators or flat walkways. And then it would be taken to a person who at a particular station would fasten a bolt or attach a steering wheel or something like that. But it was a very small job that they did. But they did that small job, and it moved on to the next guy who did another job, another part of the job, and eventually at the end you had a completed car. One advantage was this idea that this allowed Henry Ford to hire people who didn't know how to do the whole thing, so he could hire them for cheaper, but at the same time he produced a lot more. As a matter of fact, by 1923, 1 out of every 2 cars sold in the U.S. was a Model T Ford, so hugely successful. And also Teddy Roosevelt we can thank for a lot of the national parks we have. John Muir was a really important conservationist who talked about how important the environment is. And he took Teddy Roosevelt on a tour of Yosemite. Roosevelt realized, he'd already probably realized how important it was to protect the environment, but this sort of makes it really clear to him. Him being a hunter, he realized how animals need a place where they can reproduce and things like that, and so and live their lives so he had a lot of respect for nature. But he created new national parks like the Grand Canyon, created wildlife refuges, and really Teddy Roosevelt was a unique person in American history and one of the most important presidents in a lot of ways. He was kind of the ideal American for the age, and he had this expression, speak softly and carry a big stick. And one of the things that he did was he made sure that all the people realized, all the other countries realized that South America and the Caribbean was kind of his area, the Americas area, and he felt like in the Caribbean in particular, if any government that he didn't like took over, that he should be able to change it or have the government of the United States help it to change. And it's actually called the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And so this idea of going ahead and anytime someone comes up who the U.S. doesn't like, we should be able to change their government because they're close to us. And that's an interesting policy, but it's something that Teddy Roosevelt believed for that time period.